Well, over the years, I think one of the things that has been something our church has been known for is for biblical teaching. We have things like our Bible Institute. We have weekly sermons with a lot of Bible in them that have kind of made our church become known as a place where the Bible's opened, where true facts about God are communicated. And that's a good thing. And we're commanded to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the mind is part of that. And so we don't want to do any less for the life of the mind than we do. But it's also easy to be out on a backpacking trip, climbing a mountain, so focused on the map and following the right trail that we miss the views and we miss the beauty of it all. We can measure the number of miles that we're going to go. We can know which direction we're headed. We can plan for the rivers that we're going to stop at to refill our canteens, but we never pause to just take in all of the grandeur. We never stop to have our breath taken away by the majesty of the scenery because we're so focused on the things we're trying to do and on the technicalities and on the plans. C.S. Lewis says that to really experience the seashore, you need both a map of the coast and you need the experience of being there. You need both. You learn a lot from both, and we need both. And the Bible certainly gives us practical things that we should do. It provides all kinds of maps to life for sure, but that's not all it does. In fact, even more than that, it provides breathtaking views of God. It presents his majesty and beauty, not just so that we'll have 3 practical things that we can do with it this week, but so that we can stand in awe of him and worship. And one of the reasons for God giving us the Psalms, which are songs and poems, is to make sure that we experience awe, to make sure that we take in a grand view of God and to cause us to feel the weight of these truths. Because God's definitely made us to be thinkers. He's made us with minds, but we're made not just to be thinkers, but worshipers. We were hardwired for awe. We were made to behold things that are greater than us. This is why we love big views in nature. This is why we love amazing music and incredible movies, because we were made for something bigger than ourselves and grander than ourselves. And so we've been given Psalms to make sure that God is someone that we sing about, that he's not just something that we analyze, but someone that we're in awe of, someone that we celebrate, someone that we herald. He's given us minds, and he wants us to use our minds to study him. He wants us to know what he's like and what he's not like, but he doesn't want us to stop with just collecting facts. He wants it to sink in. He wants our feelings to line up with the truths that we've learned. He wants us to be able to sing these things and not just analyze and categorize them. There is a difference between knowing God so you can pass a theology test and knowing God. God doesn't just want to be studied and analyzed by his people, but he wants to be known by his people. He doesn't just want us to know what to do, he wants us to know him. And so in Psalm 139, there's not a lot of things to do. This chapter isn't mainly about some steps that we should follow this week, but it's mainly a big, beautiful, awe-inspiring picture of God and the deep sense of wonder and trembling that sets in as we start to think about all that means for our lives and all of its implications. So let's read to start just the first 6 verses here. This is a Psalm of David, and he says, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It's high, I cannot attain it." So David here, and just pausing to reflect on the majesty of God, celebrates in song God's omniscience, the fact that God is all-knowing. And this is affirmed all throughout the Bible, that God knows all things, past, present, and future. He knows all things real, all things potential. There's no detail in the entire universe that's hidden from him. Jesus said in Matthew 10:30, even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Psalm 94 verse 9 says, he who planted the ear, does he not hear? He who formed the eye, does he not see? It'd be almost ludicrous to say that the one who made us with the ability to see has anything that's hidden from his sight. And so Hebrews 4:13 says, no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. So God is perfectly all-knowing, Nothing's hidden from his sight. Nothing's obscured. And that means that there is nothing that he knows better than other things. Like, we all have areas of expertise, things that we know better than other things. But for an all-knowing God, there's nothing that he doesn't have perfect, infinite knowledge of at all times. And then on top of that, we can only pay attention to one thing at a time. You know, we like to convince ourselves that we can multitask and do a bunch of different things at once, but really, we do one thing at a time, and then we just get distracted by those other things, and we bounce around. And our phones have kind of left us where we now have the attention span of like a squirrel, and we are always focusing on a million different things, but only one at a time. But God doesn't have that same limitation. He can focus on all things at all times, completely, always. Which means that he's never surprised, he never learns anything. He knows everything about everything, he knows it all fully, and because he has full knowledge of everything, we know that he's paying attention to everything all at once. Which is interesting, but look how David is not just analyzing it, but he's beholding it, and he's in awe of it. It's hitting home for him because he's saying that the fact that God knows everything that well means that God fully knows him. In verse 1, he says, God, you have searched me. And he uses a term that maybe an archaeologist might use, that you've dug into me. You've unearthed what's down there. You know the things that were covered up. You've excavated my heart. And so let this hit home for us. God knows everything that we do. Verse 2, he knows our sitting down. He knows our rising up. He knows everything that we plan. Verse 3, he says, you know my path. He knows not just what we think, but he knows how we think, how we operate. In verse 3, he says, you know my ways. You know how I am. He knows everything we say before we do, in verse 4. And this means that God knows us better than we know ourselves. And because he doesn't know anything less well than other things, this means that God right now is paying full attention to you. And he's no less focused on you right now than he is on anybody or anything else. You have his full attention without distraction. Even if he gets a notification on his phone, he knew that was coming, and he's still focused completely on you without distraction at all, knowing you better than you know yourself. Now, you hear all that, and that might be a comfort, but it might not. Again, if you're out on a mountain and you're taking in the view from the heights, you might be soothed by looking out and seeing all the scenery and in wonder of the whole thing. But then you might also have some moments where your toes go over the edge and you look down and you're unnerved by how high up you are and what a dangerous, precarious place you're in. And you actually see the same thing throughout this psalm. This omniscience of God, the fact that he knows everything, is both a comfort, but then also a dread. It's a wonder, but then it's also something to lament. You can see how it's a wonder in verse 6. In verse 6, he's like, God, you know everything. I don't understand this. This is amazing. My mind is blown. God is incomprehensible. He's above us. He's other than us. He's worthy of our worship. This is way too wonderful for us to wrap our minds around, and so this should enhance our worship in awe of God. But then there's also a note of lament in this, where David's saying, God, you know everything about me, and I don't like it. In verse 5, he says, you hem me in. And that's not like a happy term. You know, we might think, well, that just means that God like snuggles us and cuddles us closely. But this is a word that's used elsewhere to describe a city being laid siege to and surrounded. So this phrase, hem me in, could be translated, you besiege me, or you have me trapped, or God, you've got me surrounded. So that's a really strange thought, but it makes sense. Because on a pretty deep level, we don't want anyone to know us all the way through. If we're honest, we all like to be a little bit in control of the image that we present to other people. We like to control who knows what about us. We like to control what they know. We like to control when they know these things. We want people to think of us what we want them to think of us, even if that thing that we want them to think is just a little bit untrue or not the whole story. This is why we get so concerned when we hear that somebody's talking about us. Nobody hears, hey, someone was talking about you, and none of us say, oh, good. Like, we're unnerved by that because I want to be in control of how I'm perceived. What were they saying? Why were they saying it? What was the context of that conversation? I want to be able to manage how well I'm known. This is also one of the difficulties in marriage, that it is very difficult to hide your true self from the person that you are spending more time with than anyone else on earth. You can fool a lot of people, you can maintain an image with a lot of people, but it's hard to do that with the person that you share a small space with for the rest of your life. And there are definitely times where it's frustrating, where you just feel like, dang, she knows me. Like, she knows, I can't fool her. We don't like being known that well, not in a way that's beyond our control. It's actually a place in John chapter 4 where Jesus sits with the woman at the well and he starts telling her all these things that she has done in her life. And she comes to believe in Jesus and goes back and tells all of her friends and says, come see this guy who told me everything that I've ever done before. And a lot of people responded to that invitation, but I don't know if I would have. Like, that's not the most attractive invitation. Hey, you want to come see this guy who knows everything you've ever done? I'm good. No, I don't need to do that. And so you see David here oscillating back and forth between celebrating this all-knowing, all-present God and also trying to get away from it. Verse 7, he says, where shall I go from your spirit, or where shall I flee from your presence? And the phrase that he uses here is the same phrase that's used in the beginning of the book of Jonah. So beginning of Jonah 1:1, it says, now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. So God comes to Jonah and says, hey, Jonah, there's this city. The people really hate me there, really don't like people who believe in me. So I want you to go there and tell them all about me, tell them to knock it off, tell them to believe in me. And so Jonah says, hard pass. And then his plan is to run and flee from the presence of the Lord. So David in this psalm contemplates how God knows everything about him, and he says, man, if I could get away from that, I would. But where would I go? Where could I go where the omnipresent Spirit of God is not there? Just like Jonah couldn't get away, it's not like I could get away either. So verse 8, he says, if I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. So David says here that there is nowhere that he could go that he could hide from God. And he says, at times I feel a little bit trapped by that, a little bit constrained and limited by that, but what am I going to do? It's not like I can go somewhere that he's not. He's around every corner. Everywhere I go, he's there. But at the same time, he's not only frustrated by God's sovereign rule over his life, he's also comforted by it. Notice twice now that David has mentioned the hand of God, and once it's been negatively and once it's been positively. Back in verse 5, he said, you hem me in behind and before. There's this negative, like, God, you're kind of crowding me in here. And he says, you lay your hand on me. So it's almost like the hand of pressure where God is telling me what to do, telling me who I am, telling me how to live. But then in verse 10, he uses it positively. He says, even there, your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. And he celebrates the fact that anywhere he goes, this hand of God is there to lead him and to hold him fast. So it's almost like he has this love-hate relationship with the hand of God. And honestly, isn't this normally the way that we think about it too? I mean, on the one hand, his hand creates some pressure and hems us in. God tells us what to do and not to do. God limits our options. He takes our freedom. I can't be whoever I want to be if God's hand is upon me. If there is a God, then that God has made me which means he's made me for a specific purpose. That means that his commands on my life are binding. I'm his, so I can't do whatever I want or be whatever I want. My purpose can't be defined by me. My purpose was given to me by him, that I'm supposed to glorify him and enjoy him forever. I can't be my own king, so I'm constrained. And sometimes we don't like those constraints. But then on the other hand, we desperately want his hand to guide us. We want his hand to uphold us, to support us. We love that God is a God that we can go to for wisdom. We love his guidance, except for when his guidance guides us to do something we don't want to do. We love that he'll support us, but it's the same hand that puts pressure on us to live a certain way and not another. But let's hypothetically say that we could run away from God. Let's say there was a place we could go where we could get away from him. If we get away from his hand of pressure, then where are we going for comfort and hope and peace? We'd be almost like the kids who ran away from their very demanding but very wealthy parents. Where they got away from the demands, they got their freedom, and now they're finally free, but they're also hungry and broke and don't know how to live on their own. We can try to decide to be totally free with no hand to tell us what to do, but then what hand guides us? What hand are we relying on? Where do we find our comfort? But really, that whole idea of getting away from God, it's futile anyways. Because he says here, if darkness doesn't make any difference to God, if God can see right through the darkness just like it's day, then there's certainly no running from him. There's no outwitting the wisdom of God. There's no hiding from the eye of God. And then David gives an illustration of the knowledge and the wisdom and the majesty and the presence of God everywhere by zooming in on the presence of God and the work of God in the womb. And so in verse 13, he says, "For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them." And the main point that David's making here in describing the forming of a child in his mother's womb is that God is at work, God is present, God sees, and even in the smallest and most hidden and darkest of places, he's there. So David's making that main point here, but then he has to stop in verse 14 and just praise God for his work of creating a child in the womb. And so he's saying you can't hide from God's eye-seeing eye, or God's all-seeing eye. If we weren't hidden from God when we were being woven together as microscopic little beings in our mother's womb, then there is no place that we're not fully seen by God. If God saw us when no one else could see us, then he certainly sees us now. If anywhere in the world is dark and hidden, it's in the womb. But God was there. God was there, not hindered by the intricacies or the smallness or the darkness. God was there, present, weaving us together, working without a work light, no need of anything else, fully there, fully aware of everything that was going on with us, nothing hidden from him. And if we weren't hidden from him then we certainly aren't now. So it would be crazy to think that we were getting away with anything when God saw everything that was happening while our substance was being formed together in our mother's womb in the darkest and most hidden of places. But again, as he's thinking about this, he just pauses to worship. In verse 14, he says, "I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well." So he says, of all these wonderful works of God in the universe, one of the most wonderful is the knitting together of a child in the womb of his or her mother. And by saying, I wasn't hidden from you then, so I can't hide from you now, David is affirming that he existed then. He was David in the womb. That his existence as a person didn't begin when he was born, it began when he was still very much in his mother's womb. That's when his life began. That's when he became a person. In Psalm 51, where we looked last week in verse 5, David said, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." And for David to have been sinful from the time of conception, he must have been human from the time of conception. Animals don't have a sin nature. Clumps of cells don't have a sin nature. Humans have a sin nature. And if David had that nature from the moment of conception, then he was human from the moment of conception. And I know this can be upsetting because it sounds political, but pushing politics aside, I think it's important that as Christians we affirm with the scriptures that life begins at conception. And that human life has dignity and value not because of what it can do for society, but because it's made in the image of God. Christian doctrine throughout the ages has said that the body doesn't exist before the soul, and the soul doesn't exist before the body. Our souls aren't around before the body is, and then they enter the body at some later point. And our bodies, while they're alive, always contain a soul. And so from the moment of conception, we're human. We're made in the image of God. And because we carry his image, we reflect his image, we have worth and value and dignity. It's so important that we realize that people don't get their worth from being able to contribute to society. But we get our worth because of whose image we reflect. And so that means that a newly conceived child in the womb, that means that an elderly person who's severely disabled by late-stage dementia, they both possess the image of God. Both could be perceived to be inconvenient to people around them, but they both have the image of God. We don't get our value and our worth from the things that we add to people around us. So this means that the poor, this means that people that we think can't contribute, they have the image of God on them. That's where they get their dignity. And if God knit us together, if his supremacy and sovereignty define us instead of our own self-determination, even if we're lacking what our culture says we need to be a full-fledged human, doesn't matter because our worth is fixed. We're made in his image. We do reflect it from the very beginning as soon as we're conceived. And science and reason, likewise, affirm the humanity of the unborn child. From the moment of conception, a baby possesses human DNA, with all the genetic instructions from both parents present. If the child grows, she will only grow into a more developed human, and no other type of creature could emerge. A newly conceived child is a human being. And certainly, respecting the dignity of the unborn means opposing abortion. It also means caring for moms. It means caring about the family that God has designed for raising kids. It means helping the poor. It means discipling parents. There's an awful lot that's downstream of an embrace of the image of God in all people, and God's people in many different ways should be about doing all of those things. Because God forms that life, and because that is a human being in his image, it is only his to take. And I know as we say this, that there are women who are here who have had abortions. And I know that this lands very heavily. You could be carrying the weight of guilt, and maybe nobody knows about it but God, and as you hear about God seeing all things and knowing your path, that isn't a comfort because of the weight of that guilt. But I want you to know the power of the gospel. Jesus died for our sins. So that when we believe, any sin that we turn from and confess and repent of gets hung to the cross of Jesus so that the guilt from that is removed from us. He really does take the guilt and stains, and he really will do that for you as well. You're not beyond his ability to love and his ability to redeem. Jesus forgives sinners who turn to him. So David here is enamored with this picture of God who knows all, is everywhere. He's just amazed at the whole thing. In verse 17, he says, "How precious to me are your thoughts, O God? How vast is the sum of them? If I would count them, they're more than the sand. I awake and I'm still with you." So he's like, no matter where I go, no matter what I've done, I awake and God is still there. Still knows everything. Vast is the sum of his thoughts. Then he changes gears. in what almost seems like a weird way. Verse 19, he says, "Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of blood, depart from me. They speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies." So in verse 19, David is asking for vengeance on his enemies. He's not saying that he will take their lives. He's asking God to take their lives, and at least their lives are God's to give and take. But it seems like his thoughts about God have become so important and so precious that those who speak against God, those who misuse God's name, have become like his enemies. And while we might not be able to completely relate to this, we do know that sometimes love for someone creates what feels almost like a hatred for those who would harm them. If you have kids, you've probably felt a little bit of this before. You have this intense love for your kids, and when someone would harm them, someone would hurt them, there are emotions that rise up in response to that. And so here's David, who has fallen so in love with the majesty of God, so in awe of God, he's such a worshiper of God that it seems like those who mock God and hate God are opposed to something that's incredibly precious to him, and they're his enemies. And so David here honestly expresses his feelings to God in prayer. He isn't taking his own vengeance. He's asking God to do it. And what this at least shows is that he's got this deep association with God, this deep love for God, that it's so close that those who are opposed to God's glory become very frustrating, like an enemy. But nonetheless, you go to the New Testament, and Jesus calls us to this standard. He says in Matthew 5, "You've heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy,' but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who's in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust." Now, in a second, we'll talk about what made the difference here. But first, let's look at what David says at the end of this psalm. In verse 23, he says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." And this is a really bold prayer, especially in light of what David just said. He just said God sees and knows all things. Nothing's hidden from God. He's asked God to carry out vengeance on wicked people. And then David says to God, "Search me." He just prayed for God to slay the wicked, and then he asked God to fully examine him. This would be like marching into the IRS with all of your receipts from last year, and you say, "All tax cheats should go to jail. Examine my paperwork." It's bold. And so how can David pray this? And there have been a number. Like, as we go through this psalm, it seems like there are loose ends and there are contradictions. Like, David wants to get away from God's knowledge of him, yet also he invites it and revels in it. David wants to get away from God's hand as it restricts, but he embraces it when it guides and upholds. David bristles at a God who steals his options and his freedoms, yet he loves God's guidance. He starts out like afraid of God's scrutiny because of what's in his heart, and yet he prays for God's judgment on the wicked and says, "Search my heart." So it's like this psalm is loaded with these enigmas and contradictions. How could all of this be in the same psalm? Well, the answer is that these words are not only David's words, but they're the inspired words of God. And this is not just an isolated song, but it's part of an entire story. And the focus of that whole story is the cross of Jesus that makes sense of all of this. So, for example, we are hungry for God's majesty. We need his presence. We also want to be fully known and fully loved by God. But we also know that we're wicked. We also know that there are unpleasant things in us. And any God who knows us the way God knows us, any God who knows us better than we know ourselves, well, surely he would reject us. He'd surely judge us. Certainly he would carry out the vengeance on us that David prayed for here. It's like we want to be fully known and fully loved by God, but because of our sin, we're unlovable. We want that comfort of his presence, but because of our sin, we also want to run away from it all. Well, the good news is that Jesus went to the cross. And he fully knows us. He knew our sin. He knew our rebellion against God. He knew that because of what was going on in our hearts, we would just assume flee from God's presence. But still, he fully loved us. He went to the cross and he paid for that. He went to the cross as our substitute to absorb the wrath of God that was stored up for the wicked, that wrath that we deserve. So that if by faith we will receive that free gift, we're forgiven and cleansed. So we can be fully known and fully loved and accepted. Because Jesus took our sin, we can say to God, search me and know that we're not going to face his vengeance because of that, because Jesus took the vengeance. And we can say it with confidence that we are accepted and we're loved by God if we've laid hold of Jesus by faith. Also, we have this love-hate relationship with God's hand. We want it to guide us. We want him to hold us fast. We want him to care for us and support us. But we don't love that hand that tells us what to do because that seems so unpleasant. And honestly, sometimes we kind of believe that it would be bad for us if we were to follow what God clearly told us to do. We don't really trust that those commands would be good. We don't really trust that they'd be good for us. Well, the cross is the answer to that too. Because the God who loved us enough to send his son to die for us on the cross is the same God who gave us those commands. And so when we look at one of his commands and we wonder, I doubt that this would be good. This isn't what I want. This doesn't seem right. It seems like I could get in trouble if I follow this. I don't want to obey that. We know that that command is coming from the exact same heart that sent his son to be crucified and die for us. So while we may not always know what the outcomes are here on earth, humanly speaking, for obeying his clear commands, we can know that the heart behind those commands is good. And if God knows us better than we know ourselves, then we can know that he knows better than we do what's good for us. You also see here the apparent contradiction between David praying for vengeance on his enemies and Jesus saying to pray for and love your enemies. But again, the cross makes the difference. God's truest heart for his enemies like us is that we would be forgiven and saved. And when we look at that gospel story, that I was an enemy of God and then he sent his son to die to redeem me, he forgave me so much. When I believe that that's true for me, then I can look at even my worst enemies as people who are just like me and very much in need of redemption. And definitely, it's a dread and something to want to get away from sometimes in our hearts, that God knows us better than we know ourselves. Unless we know that he died for our sins and our insufficiencies, and that even though he knows us that well, God loves us far more than we could ever imagine. It's that deep desire we have to be insiders, that deep desire to be fully known and fully loved is met in Jesus. So the application of this is stand in awe of him today. Trust him with your life today. If you don't yet believe, turn from sin and unbelief and those other ultimates, those other things that were the biggest deal to you, and trust in his death, burial, and resurrection, and find in him the welcome that your heart desires at its deepest level. And if you're running from him, well, that's futile. Just turn back. If you're refusing his constraining hand, lay that down. And trust that if he loved you enough to send his son, then that same heart of love is the heart that commands you and is only for your good. Stand in awe of this God and run toward him because of what Jesus has purchased on the cross.